General Eberhart, General Arnold, I want to associate myself with the remarks that Senator Kerry made, that under the circumstances, especially as we've outlined them here today, the response of NORAD was quite remarkable. Particularly given the fact that this was so unprecedented and we were dealing with a different kind of hijacking than we had previously anticipated. It seems to me, however, that it was remarkable in part because people didn't necessarily go through the appropriate chains of command. Whatever the mistakes that the FAA made here in Washington, D.C., Boston called Otis directly, which it was not supposed to do. And Colonel Marr responded immediately under, according to our statement here, by ordering the Otis fighters to battle stations. Did Colonel Marr have the authority to do that without it coming from someone other than just a request from Otis? Was he acting on his own in making that decision?
Of course, Colonel Marr was commander of the Northeast Air Defense Sector, so that communication, they called the towers, I understand, at Otis first, and then they called Colonel Marr.
Okay.
And he did have the authority to put them on battle stations, right. Certainly. He then called me.
And you told him.
Well, he said, I'd like to scramble. That's what he told me.
And you said, scramble, I'll get the authority later.
Exactly.
So were you exercising an authority that you didn't have? Should you have gone higher before you ordered the scramble?
I can order a scramble. The issue is whether or not we intercept the hijacked airplane. Mm-hmm. So we got the airplanes airborne, put them out in a warning area where they are allowed to fly anyway, then to determine whether we're going to have the priorities to...
And so you had to go higher up before you sent them to New York?
Sure. I called the General Finley, who was your DO, and told him what we're doing. He said, fine, we'll get the authorities. And but the fact that they were going towards New York, from my perspective, is because that's where the warning area was initially, because we didn't know that, we certainly didn't know that the hijacked airplane, even after we saw on television the smoking hole in the World Trade Center, as tragic as that was, we did not know that that was caused by one of the hijacked airplanes.
Now, it's not in the report that we gave here today, but I understand from our staff that in your in a staff interview with you, General Arnold, you said that if you had deemed it necessary, you would have communicated a shoot-down order, even though you hadn't heard through the Secretary of Defense or the Vice President of anyone else, if you felt that it was necessary. Is that correct?
I sure hope that I would never have to come to that. I think it was a reference to United 93. Mm-hmm. United 93, but very shortly, I guess by the time we had heard about it, your staff tells me, because we did not know that, the airplane was had already hit the ground up in Pennsylvania, thanks to the heroic efforts of those passengers that were on board. And the question that came to me was, what would you have done? And we were, at that time, again, seeking presidential authority to shoot that aircraft down, and as we were flying towards it. So it never came to that point. But it's very typical in intercept. You try to get that airplane, get beside them, get their attention, see if they'll respond to you. And based on what had happened earlier, and we knew what happened earlier, obviously, the question came to me, what would you have done? And using some emergency authorities, and God help me if I'd ever had to do this, we would have given the order to shoot them down.
And you would have been taking a huge responsibility on yourself in doing that, would you not?
Would have, yes. But at that particular point in time, we fully anticipated that we would get presidential authority.
Now, you saw earlier during the course of the staff presentation the very elaborate system of going up through the FAA and then down through the military before before many of these orders can be made, in theory at least. I take it, General Eberhart, that chain of command is somewhat attenuated now, and that we can respond much more quickly?
Yes, sir, it is, and for a variety of reasons. I mean, we go all the way to the cockpit. In the cockpit today, if anything happens in that airplane that seems unusual, the first thing the crew does is get off a call and change their transponder. So time starts to work for us right there. The second thing that happens that as soon as there's a problem, and FAA knows we're listening on the same network, and we know as soon as the FAA knows that there's a problem. And then as we start to get more information, we'll put aircraft on battle stations, or we'll even launch them even if FAA hasn't asked or TSA has not asked, because as Larry said, we can launch them anytime we want to, send them on a training sortie and head them toward what we think might be the problem. So that type of cooperation and coordination, coupled with this increased situational awareness of netting the radars, and in some cases data link, where we can data link that target right to the cockpit of the airplane, makes us much more responsive and unlikely to have the problems that we had on 9/11.
Thank you very much to both of you.
I've got a couple of questions. First of all, beside the sites you had, the 14 alerted planes, the 7 sites, what about other assets? I mean, did you have, what about the National Guard sites, Coast Guard, Customs, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms? Or usually you think of those planes, helicopters, whatever, being alert and ready, and what about those assets? Did you have those available to you?
Sir, on 9/11, in terms of the other assets, we did not track them, and we were not linked to them from other government agencies. And so we had not factored them into our air defense because we believed the attack was going to come in the form of an enemy bomber at 35,000 feet at 0.8 Mach, et cetera, and they don't have the capacity or capability to deal with that. They are now factored in.
So you had no link to those other assets on that day, and you do now?
Exactly. Now, no link is not exactly right. As we worked some drug enforcement issues, we worked with different organizations where that we would, if they didn't have an asset available, we would go track an asset for them and tell them what we saw, identify it, and tell them where it landed. And then it was a law enforcement issue in terms of what suspected drug trafficking. So we had that linkage through different organizations. But I think it's important to note, and it's back to the Commissioner Lehman's question, is that we have access to all those assets, but right now, if we had to go get them right this minute and have them take off, they're not armed. They're not armed. They're not armed for good reason, because they're going to go fly a training sortie. So you don't want to be up there flying training sorties armed. So we would have to upload the munitions. And so therefore, if it's a come-as-you-are party or tragedy, as it was that morning, we had to take the assets that were armed, because otherwise all they could go up and do is observe, which is better than nothing, but it doesn't work the problem. And with notification, as we increase the air defense level today, then we arm more aircraft and put more aircraft on alert. So that's how the system works. So even though, for example, we talk about the aircraft that took off from Andrews that morning, they weren't armed. So they were observers, is what they were. So they couldn't have shot down an airplane if need be. So I think it's important to note that. So we have lots of airplanes around there, but then to get them airborne and make a difference, that's the challenge.
So the first aircraft were unarmed, then you launched aircraft that were armed?
No, sir. NORAD's airplanes were launched armed. We were not running the F-16s out of Andrews. Those were not initially armed, and then they came back and armed.
And none of these other assets, alcohol, tobacco, firearms, none of those other people are armed?
No, if you go to you pick an Air Force base today, Seymour Johnson, and you walk on base today, none of the airplanes are armed. They may have training munitions on them, but they're not armed for daily training. That's for the safety of people on the ground and people who are working around those airplanes.
And if I understood you earlier, if 9/11 happened today, you believe you could have intercepted all 4 planes?
Yes, sir. And we've shared these models with the staff, and the staff has looked at them, and I think they agree that when we compare the notification times and we compare the results, if you will, on 9/11, we got 6 minutes of notification time for American Airlines Flight 11. Today, we believe we would have at least 17 minutes to make that decision. On 9/11, we were 153 miles away. Today, we would be in position to fire for 8 minutes. 8 minutes that we could decide that this is a hostile act that's got its nose down. Because it's very important to note that if an airplane's flying straight and level at 35,000 feet or 30,000 feet, even if it's been hijacked, we haven't seen a hostile act yet. It could be a classical, traditional hijacking, or we may have brave souls on board like we had United Airlines Flight 93, and they wrest control back. It's important for us to see a hostile act.
Yeah, and there was never, are assuming a different set of facts, different timelines than occurred.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I am assuming that they told us, FAA told us as soon as they knew.
Yeah, so you wouldn't have had the 7 minutes, 5 minutes, 14 minutes, and 47
yes,
minutes.
That's the key. That's the difference.
Was there any consideration ever of ramming any of those planes?
Sir, we did not consider that because we were never in such a position to be able to do that. So that didn't cross our paths, our idea. During the Cold War, that was one of the things that we looked at in terms of enemy bombers. But I would say it was a much different airplane then, and it was an airplane where we had a very large tail hook that we would drop, and theoretically we would drag that across the cockpit of the enemy bomber. Now, I wouldn't want to be the one who does that, but if we thought that enemy bomber had nuclear weapons on it and was coming to the U.S., it's probably a last-ditch maneuver. These are much different airplanes today than those airplanes we were talking about during the Cold War, the F-06, 106, et cetera.
And just in one matter, just to clarify the staff records from the staff anyway, that the planes we have that took off from Andrews were launched at 10:38. Those were unarmed, according to our staff report. Planes that were launched at 10:42 and 11:09 were armed. So the first planes launched were unarmed. According to our
Again,
staff report.
they were not under our command and control, but my knowledge now is a little bit different, because I believe that one of those airplanes, the first ones were definitely unarmed. I don't think they got the second set completely armed. They may have armed the gun, which had training munitions in it, but I would think it was probably the third or fourth set that got up that had missiles, and it was a full-up round, if you will.
Commissioner Gorelick?
A couple of follow-up questions. First, for General Arnold. You testified before us before that the jets were scrambled in response to Flight 93, not American 11. And when you were asked about...
I was wrong.
Yeah, but the question about that is, and I want to be fair to you and give you an opportunity to respond, you said that the reason that you were wrong is that you hadn't had an opportunity to listen to the tapes, or the tapes were not accessible. But, I mean, we have, I'm just holding 4 of them, different headquarters and CONAR logs that are clearly reflect that the scrambling was done in response to this phantom American 11, which didn't exist anymore. And it was your responsibility, as I recall, to do the after-action report, or to lead it, or to be in part responsible for it. Did you not look at the logs in that process?
Well, you referred to an after-action report that we didn't do. I mean, I don't recall doing an after-action
Well,
report,
maybe-
other than the fact that we tried to capture when the aircraft took off and when they, how soon we were able to react to those aircraft, and that was the real issue. So as I get older, I guess my memory was not as good as it should be, and your staff actually helped me out quite a bit in terms of this one particular area, because I was never comfortable with the fact that some people had said we had scrambled because of American 77. And that I knew was not the case, so I guess in the way the human mind works, unfortunately, is we try to put things into some kind of categories. And then as we heard this log, or this log was presented to me, it made more sense to me then that that's what had occurred. It occurred to us. We'd now had 2 airplanes that hit, and we got a call that another airplane, because it was another airplane to me, had been hijacked. And so now the Northeast Air Defense Sector correctly was scrambling aircraft out of Langley to get an aircraft over Washington, D.C. in case that aircraft that was called was headed towards Washington, D.C.
The reason I return to this is that as a consequence of the NORAD conclusion that the jets were scrambled in response to notification on 93, was that senior policymakers reassured the American public that our military was on it and would have addressed this threat to the White House or the Capitol before the threat arrived. And that may or may not be the case. We have real doubts about whether it would have been possible to intercept that flight in any event, but certainly not with the notice that was received. I'd like to follow up on some questions, General Eberhart, that you've been asked this morning. I'm struck by 2 times. After the Second World Trade Center was hit at 9:03, I think everybody concluded we were under attack. And as I understand it, you have the authority to put in place something that I don't know what it stands for, called SCTANA, which is essentially that you, the military, take control of the skies from the civilians, FAA, and that you did that at around 11. And my question for you is, why that gap? And whose decision would that have been?
SCTANA is a procedure that, as you say, allows us to take control of the airspace. It's a procedure that was designed, again, to counter the Soviet Union and their long-range bombers. It's a procedure that if I had tried, and as the people approached me with declare SCTANA, the problem was that we could not control the airspace that day with the radars we had and all the aircraft that were airborne, 4,000 to 5,000 airplanes airborne. So if I suddenly say, we've got it, we will control the airspace, we would have had worse problems than we had that morning, because I cannot provide traffic deconfliction like the FAA has. What mine is designed to do is, we see a bomber coming from a long range, we tell everybody to get the aircraft down safely, then nothing flies, and we control the airspace. We're prepared to do that, but we're not prepared suddenly to take control of the airspace and say we have it, because now we're talking in terms of safety and security of air travel. We're talking about a bad situation getting worse.
So you cannot...
The other thing, and I have the authority to do that, but I have the authority to do it against an external threat. The second thing is that's very important to note. There are procedures in SCTANA that are, again, designed to counter long-range bombers. For example, we're supposed to turn off all the navigational aids. That morning, the last thing we wanted to do was turn off all the navigational lights. You turn them off so the enemy bombers can't use them. But we don't want to turn them off so that the airplanes can't land safely. We don't want to turn them off so that law enforcement and Flight for Life can't fly. So what we did, and you said we executed it, but I think it's very important to note that when we executed a modified Skatana. And that's what I told them is I will execute Skatana once you have a modified Skatana that clearly delineates the lines in the road and doesn't cause a bad situation from getting worse. So our Skatana said, leave the nav aids on. Our Skatana said, FAA, you still control the traffic that's flying. Our Skatana said, law enforcement and Flight for Life can continue to fly. We don't want to ground them during this terrible tragedy. And then procedures for getting waivers to fly. So we had to take that procedure and modify it to this horrific act that occurred on 9/11.
So another needed improvisation on your part, because this was a scenario that we had not planned for.
I don't say that to pat myself or ourselves on the back, but that's what we did.
Thank you.
Commissioner Lehman?
Thank you. In this era of jointness, I think it's very unfair that the only sailor on the panel hasn't taken his fair share of hits. So, Captain Leidig, you were the administrator of the NMCC, the National Military Command Center, at the time. It's still confusing to me from the records of our staff at the tactical level who really was in charge, whether it was NORAD or whether FAA saw it as the NMCC, whatever the NMCC is as an entity. First, would you explain what you viewed the role of the NMCC to be that morning at that time?
Yes, sir. In the National Military Command Center, I was the Deputy Director for Operations, so I was the Senior Watch Officer in the National Military Command Center. Initially, when the first plane was reported on the news to have crashed in the first Trade Center tower, the National Military Command Center was primarily a means to notify senior leadership that, in fact, an event had occurred. After the second aircraft impacted the second tower, the command center then became a focal point for coordinating information flow. And at that point, I convened by the procedures that existed on 9/11, I convened a conference called a Significant Event Conference. And what that does is that brings leadership and combatant commanders into the conference to start discussing what action should be taken or might be taken. And so at that point, I as the Senior Watch Officer, then control a conference that gets all these folks on the phone. FAA was tried to be included in that conference, and we had difficulty throughout the morning getting them in the conference, and that hampered information flow to some degree.
So why didn't somebody just pick up their cell phone and call them?
Yes, sir. We did open a separate line to them, but the conference is on a special phone circuit and is classified to be able to pass information and relay information between very senior leadership all the way over to the White Houses, and in some cases the President can be included on
But
those
how
conferences.
long was FAA out of connectivity to this conferencing?
Sir, I couldn't tell you. I don't know how long. I know that they were intermittently in. Most of the time they were not in the conference.
They were not in. And do
Right.
you think that interfered with NORAD learning about 93, which was a pretty critical failure of the...
I can't speak to
Today?
that specific flight, sir, but I can say that it did hamper information flow because we were getting information in a more roundabout way from FAA. Sometimes it would come from a local commander to NORAD back to us, or sometimes it would come on an open line. We were trying to maintain just an open telephone line to the operations center at FAA.
Wouldn't it have been better to have FAA communicating directly with FAA and with NMCC monitoring if they could, but not being the focal point?
I'm not sure I understand your question. Could you say it one more time again, sir?
Well, if the commander of NORAD had picked up the phone and set up a line, secure or insecure, with the head of FAA or whoever had the OPCON at FAA, it seems to me that things would have worked a lot better than had everybody had to hook into this teleconference. Was it a teleconference or a voice conference?
It's a voice conference,
Voice
sir.
conference.
Yes, sir.
So
I don't know if I
drawing
can
it up-
speak for NORAD, but I can say that the conference as set up includes a combatant commander and other entities, and so they're all on a conference, whether it's controlled elsewhere or not. I don't know if it would have helped information flow, but if FAA had been in the same conference that was being directed by the National Military Command Center, the information flow would have went directly to NORAD because they're in that conference.
Do you think the insistence on having a secure line as opposed to an open line, which is what FAA's excuse is, was the main problem? And if so, why was it necessary?
I know some changes have been made in the command center. I apologize. I've been gone from the Joint Staff for over a year now, and I'm not familiar with the upgrades. I understand on that day that there was some compatibility issues between their secure phone and ours in the command center that caused them to drop out of the conference, but I'm not aware of the technical aspects of it.
General Eberhart, did you find that the setup that was quickly put together going through the NMCC a help or a hindrance in retrospect?
Sir, in retrospect, I think it was a help, because you have to have all these different players with all these different interests and responsibilities and authorities up on the conference. At the same time, because of just what you've said, today we have all sorts of alternate paths to the FAA at the tactical and operational and strategic levels. I don't think, had FAA been up at that time, that we would have gotten any different information, because I don't think that the sectors, the FAA regions, had up-channeled this to the headquarters, and that's who we're talking to when we talk to. And remember, on Flight 93, they didn't know where 93 was. And so when you see the line on the chart that reflies 93, we postulate that based on the last radar contact and where it crashed, sadly. So they didn't have the radar track, so therefore they couldn't tell us where it was.
Captain, were you satisfied with the connectivity you had with the White House, with the Vice President, and through him to the President, or directly, say, to Air Force One?
So we were connected to the White House, and I was satisfied with the communications to the White House.
Do you have any personal lessons learned? You're no longer there, but you certainly went through one of the most frantic crises as to those arrangements.
Sir, the most significant lesson, and I think you've kind of zeroed in on it, was the communications capabilities and the ability to bring leadership at the important organizations together to make a decision in a timely manner. We were hampered that day by communications, and any improvements in that area would be significant.
Yeah, I think also, we all know that there are always communications glitches, and there have got to be workarounds. I mean, the fact was that FAA headquarters did know about 93 very early on, from 934 on. And if somebody had just picked up the phone to keep the connectivity open, it could have made a difference. Thank you.
Commissioner Roma?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Captain, just a brief follow-up to Commissioner Lehman's last question. He asked you, were you satisfied with your connectivity to the White House and Air Force One? You said you were satisfied with the White House. Were you satisfied with Air Force One? And I think it's been conveyed to you that in our interview with the President said he was very frustrated and troubled with connections and connectivity that day.
Sir, I can't speak to the connectivity with Air Force One. I was connected to the White House, and my understanding is Air Force One was in contact with the White House Situation Room. I was not in contact with Air Force One.
So you have no knowledge of that?
No, sir.
Yeah, is there no NMCC protocol to connect directly with Air Force One?
Yes, sir, there is a capability to do that. On that day, we were connected with the White House.
Why weren't you using that other capability?
I don't recall, sir.
General Eberhart, a question about our training posture on the day of 9/11. On page 5 of our staff statement, the FAA says at 8:38 in the morning Hi, Boston Center, TMU, we have a problem here. We have a hijacked aircraft headed towards New York, and we need you guys we need someone to scramble some F-16s or something up there. Help us out. NIAD says, is this real world or an exercise? My question is, you were postured for an exercise against the former Soviet Union. Did that help or hurt? Did that help in terms of were more people prepared? Did you have more people ready? Were more fighters fueled with more fuel? Or did this hurt in terms of people thinking, no, there's no possibility that this is real world. We're engaged in an exercise and delay things? Or did it have both impacts?
Sir, my belief is that it helped because of the manning, because of the focus, because the crews, they have to be airborne in 15 minutes, and that morning, because of the exercise, they were airborne in 6 or 8 minutes. And so I believe that focus helped. The situation that you're referring to, I think at most cost us 30 seconds. 30 seconds for
Well,
that.
that's what we have recorded. I just wondered if there was more of that down the line.
No, it became painfully clear, Commissioner, that this was not an exercise.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Our last questioner for this panel will be Commissioner Benveniste.
Yes, I'd like to first relay information again from our staff report, and so that there is clarity in the record. It is our information that that FAA tracked Flight 93 from the moment it was hijacked. The problem was that it did not communicate the hijack information to NORAD, so that NORAD was in position with unarmed planes over Washington and the Cap at some point.
Armed.
First unarmed, and then
First armed. First armed.
and then the Andrews planes
We're unarmed.
were unarmed.
30 minutes later.
Okay, so the point is that whether or not, well, because the shoot-down order had not been communicated, whether or not those planes could have been, that plane could have been intercepted and shot down was a matter of speculation within our staff report. So with agreement on that,
Sir, I believe there is a time there where FAA lost radar contact with this airplane. And that's what I believe I remember, so we'll have to check the record.
the information we have is they lost it briefly around Pittsburgh and they picked it back up again. So let me move to another question to try.
This one question has come up repeatedly, and I think it needs to be put in proper perspective. I'm not trying to defend Colonel Marr, but I think you need to understand that these aircraft that were airborne over Washington, D.C. at that particular time were not, as we call it, paired. They were not directed at an aircraft at that particular time.
Right.
And the way we train, with peacetime rules of engagement, the way we train is we pass along the authorities when they're required. So we require them to go out and intercept that airplane, not to shoot that airplane down, but to try to divert that aircraft away from Washington, D.C. And then with the authorities that we had or would have had from the President at that particular time, when the time was pertinent, we would have said, you're cleared to fire. And that is the way we train. That's what the pilots would have expected. And so I don't find anything wrong with what Colonel Marr did. In fact, I think what General Eberhart stated was we're more concerned about shooting down an airplane that we had a lot of airplanes flying at that particular time.
I would not in any way, shape, or form seek to minimize the concern about shooting down an unarmed plane that posed no threat to the capital of the United States. My only point there was to clarify the record with respect to the time at which FAA had the plane, knowing it was hijacked. The issue which we have repeatedly come back to is the disconnect between the fact that this plane was hijacked, that FAA knew it, but did not communicate that information to NORAD. That problem was exacerbated by the fact that in our prior hearings and through prior public statements, there was a suggestion that NORAD was positioned in a knowing way with respect to both Flights 77 and 93. Now, I want to turn to one other area where there has been some misconception, and perhaps I can start with Admiral Leidig. In this regard, you were a participant on the air threat conference call.
Yes, sir.
And you recall at some point, we have it at the 1037, that the Vice President of the United States reported on that call that there was an anonymous threat against Air Force One using the then code name Angel, that it was to be the next target. You recall that, sir?
Sir, I think that occurred right after I was relieved on the watch by General Winfield. Right after we resolved what was going on with United 93, around that time, General Winfield took over. So I'm familiar because I've looked at the transcript, but I wasn't on the conference at that time.
Now, let me ask General Eberhart and General Arnold whether that information was communicated to you in any real-time basis.
No, sir, not to me.
The information, according to the staff, that was another phantom report, that there was no anonymous call, there was no use of the code name Angel for Air Force One, or a statement that Air Force One was to be next, and yet that mythology was perpetuated for some weeks, if not months, thereafter. And as we know, those things, it's hard for them to go away. So to the best of your knowledge here, do you have any information which would suggest that there was a threat received on September 11th against Air Force One?
I was not aware of it that day nor this day, Mr. Commissioner.
Nor was I.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
That concludes our questions for this panel. I want to thank you all very much.